Which Indian state has the largest forest area? Which Indian river is known as Dakshin Ganga? Which city is called the Diamond City of India? Which Indian state is known as the Land of Five Rivers? Which Indian state has the longest national highway? Which Indian city is famous for its Mysore Palace? Which Indian airport is the busiest? Which state is famous for Kaziranga National Park? Which state has the highest number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites? Which festival is called the Festival of Colors? Who was the first woman Prime Minister of India? Which Indian state is known for the festival Onam? In which state is the Sun Temple of Konark located? Which city is known as the Manchester of India? What is the national flower of India? Which is the longest highway in India? Which is the highest waterfall in India? Which state is famous for the Gir National Park? Which is the smallest national park in India? Which city is called the Steel City of India? Which state is famous for the festival Baisakhi? Which port is the oldest in India? Which city is known as the Orange City? What is the national song of India? Which is the national reptile of India? Which state is famous for the festival Pongal? Which Indian state has the longest coastline? What is the national tree of India? Which Indian state has the highest literacy rate? Which is the national river of India? Which is the largest freshwater lake in India? Which state is known as the Jewel of India? Which is the highest dam in India? Which is the biggest desert in India? Which is the longest river in India? Which Indian state is known as the land of festivals? Which is the highest peak in India? Which Indian city is called the Pink City? Which Indian state is famous for tea gardens? Which Indian city is known as the Queen of the Hills? Which Indian state has the most number of airports? Which state is called the Sugar Ball of India? Which city is famous for Charminar? Which Indian city is known as the Blue City? Which is the oldest mountain range in India? Which Indian city is known for its IIT and ISRO hub? Who is known as the Nightingale of India? Which Indian state is the largest producer of wheat? Which Indian city hosted the first Asian Games? Who was the first woman to climb Mount Everest from India? Which missile is known as Agni? Which Indian state shares the longest border with Bangladesh? Which Indian festival celebrates the victory of good over evil? What is the total number of states and union territories in India? Which city is known as the Crown of India? Which city is known as the Heritage City of India? Which state is known as the Spice Garden of India? Which city is known as the Silicon Valley of India? Which state is famous for the dance form Kathakali? Which is the smallest state of India by population? Which city is known as the City of Joy? Which city is called the Tea City of India? Which state is famous for the Meenakshi temple? Which city is known as the City of Seven Islands? Which state is known for the Dudh Sagar waterfall? Which Indian city is known for the Golden Temple? What is the national aquatic animal of India? Which Indian city is known as the City of Dreams? Which state is known for the dance form Garba? Thank you for watching. See you in the next part. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.